Samwell Tarly had never thought himself destined for greatness, let alone rebellion. He was the eldest son of Randall Tarly, Lord of Horn Hill, and from a young age he had been taught to fear the man's voice and hard-handed discipline. Randall expected strength and valor in his heir, a skill at arms, a mastery of the hunt, and the iron will that defined House Tarly. Sam had none of those qualities, or so it was presumed, and was soon stripped of his inheritance and sent away to the wall, effectively banished by his own father. The old lord had even threatened Sam with death if he did not take the black. Sam went, tears in his eyes and shame in his heart, believing he could never live up to the proud Tarly lineage and their ancestral sword, Heartsbane. In the years that followed, Sam fought his own battles against fear, self-doubt, the creatures of the long night, and the politics that so entangled Westeros. He discovered a different kind of strength in himself, one of the mind rather than brute force. Yet somewhere deep within him, there had always been a flickering ember of the father's spirit he had once thought entirely foreign. Perhaps it was sparked the night at the Fist of the First Men, when he slew a White Walker with dragonglass. Or perhaps it was kindled over long nights spent poring over ancient tomes in the vaults of Castle Black, gleaning knowledge that would help save humanity from the endless winter. But it was there. It was real. And as the realm continued in disarray, with kings and queens dying, crows squabbling at the edges, and war after war stripping away the old order, that ember grew. He had found love in Gilly and fatherly devotion in her son. He had grown to care for people who once would have been no more than strangers in the street. He had learned that his mind was not a craven's mind, but that of a scholar, a learned man who held knowledge as a weapon sharper than any steel. He had parted ways with Jon Snow, who rose to improbable power himself, and he had studied at the Citadel in Old Town. The realm had changed so drastically. Kings rose and fell, dragons died and soared. Yet Samwell Tarly found himself always drawn back to the memory of Horn Hill, of the father who disowned him, and of the ancestral Valyrian steel sword that he had stolen away in the dead of night. Heartsbane. It lay hidden in a chest of woolen blankets in the small, modest quarters he occupied near the Citadel. He had taken it as he fled Horn Hill on the darkest hour of night some time ago, terrified that if anyone discovered he had taken it, they would hunt him. He told himself it was a necessity because the sword was invaluable in the fight against the undead. But now the war for the Dawn had passed. His father had perished in the conflict that came after, or so Sam believed from the rumors that swept Westeros. In the chaos, House Tarly had been broken, left in partial ruin. Some said the seat of Horn Hill was under uncertain rule, with Sam's younger brother, Dickon Tarly, long dead by then, and lesser houses circling. The Tarly banners that once soared high in pride were torn and blackened. Of the once lordly estate, only a battered handful of sworn swords and tenants remained, all eyeing a new occupant or a new overlord to claim their fealty. Sam felt the weight of his old life tugging at him. Countless nights he wrestled with the question. Should he return? Could he restore House Tarly? The longing to set things right warred with the insecurities that had always defined him. But the realm's troubles did not end with the long night or the crowning of a new monarch. The new crown's edicts, taxing the small folk mercilessly, sending men to die in new conflicts for personal vendettas, reconquering rebellious territories, had stirred something in many corners of the Seven Kingdoms. Another wave of unrest was rising. Where once the wars of kings and queens had battered the realm, now came the wars of lords and petty tyrants, each with their own claim or ambition. The small folk suffered, and the lesser lords chose sides, or cowered in their halls, or waited for the next blow to strike. There was talk that the crown was forging alliances with foreign powers that would put the old ways of Westeros to shame. There was talk of forced conversions, forced marriages, new laws that threatened to upend the age-old traditions that the lords were sworn to keep. Rumors abounded that the Citadel itself might be threatened if the new king or queen determined the maesters were too meddlesome. Sam felt a stirring, a question of duty. He was not only a man of the Night's Watch but also a maester in training. And though the vows he had taken once upon a time bound him to the Watch, the realm's leaders seemed bent on violence. Sam saw how the people were tired, hungry, resentful, and fearful, Soldiers marched in the name of a crown that changed hands so frequently that it hardly felt stable. Rulers in King's Landing made decisions on a whim, ignoring commoners, ignoring tradition, ignoring justice. What good was all his knowledge if he could not stand for the people who needed that knowledge, that compassion, the most? What if he might actually do something beyond writing letters and hoping that somehow reason would prevail? He had no illusions he could sway King's Landing with reason or knowledge alone. But he thought of Heartsbane, of the Tarly name. If he were to claim that name and the sword with it, would the lords of the Reach rally to him? His father had always commanded respect. House Tarly was second only to House Tyrell in the Reach back in the day. Though the Tyrells were gone, swallowed by the conflicts and tragedies that had befallen them, the Tarly name might still hold weight. But Sam Tarly, the self-professed coward, the black brother who had fled, who had stolen from his father, would anyone follow him? This question haunted him as he tried to sleep in his cramped living quarters with Gilly and the boy. He stared at the trunk containing Heartsbane. A memory replayed in his head. His father's voice, calling him a disgrace. He recalled the heavy weight of the sword, how out of place it felt in his soft, bookish hands. Yet something else spoke to him too. The memory of the bright white walker that crumbled beneath his dragonglass dagger. Sam had faced his own terrors, from whites to the unknown. Perhaps he was not the man he had been. Perhaps he could do what needed to be done. Not with brutality and proud swagger, but with that quiet determination that had guided him through the cold nights beyond the wall, that had saved Gilly, that had discovered the secrets to stave off the endless night. And maybe, just maybe, he could stand for something more now. On a quiet evening, after Gilly had put the boy to bed, Sam lit a single candle and knelt by the trunk. He lifted the lid, rummaged under the folded wool blankets, and pulled the blade free of its scabbard. He stared at the gleaming steel in the candlelight. There was a ripple to its edge that told of its Valyrian origins. He placed his hand on the hilt. The pommel was shaped like the proud huntsman's sword, crowned with the Tarly sigil that once meant so much to his forebears. He could almost see his father's scowl in the metal's reflection. "You're not meant for swords," Randall Tarly had once spat at him. "You're meant for a maester's chain, or better yet, a fool's motley." But Samwell Tarly touched the edge of the blade. There was power in the steel, in the name that it carried, Heartsbane. A name of finality, of death. What if he could make it a symbol of hope instead? He found the words tumbling from his lips, barely above a whisper. "I will not be as he was. I will not be Randall Tarly. I'll do this my way." He felt Gilly's presence behind him. Her hand rested gently on his shoulder. She looked down at the sword and then into his eyes. He swallowed, uncertain how to begin to explain, but she only gave him a soft smile. "I've always known you were brave, Sam," she said. That was all she said. But it was enough to make him feel stronger than any compliment or harsh word from his father had done before. For the first time, he thought that maybe this was possible. That maybe Samwell Tarly, as improbable as it sounded, could hold Heartsbane aloft and rally a cause. The next day, Sam met with a handful of maesters whom he trusted. Word had come that the new occupant on the Iron Throne, a distant and fractious Targaryen pretender who had tenuous claim at best, was raising men across the Crownlands and the Reach to put down all who might question the authority of King's Landing. The Ravens brought accounts of farmsteads burned, small folk forced to feed armies they could hardly afford to host, and arrests of any lord with rumored disloyalty. Taxes soared, the roads were thick with bandits and highwaymen, and the entire region teetered on the brink of open revolt. But a revolt with no leader would be easily crushed. It was a moment that called for a strong, recognized name, one that people still remembered, even if that memory was tinged with fear of Randall Tarly's strictness. Sam listened to everything the maesters told him. They had no illusions that the Citadel would remain untouched in the next wave of unrest. They also suspected the Iron Throne might eventually try to muzzle or subdue the maesters if they ventured to disagree with the new king's edicts. It had happened before in history. The first signs of tyranny often involved controlling the flow of knowledge. Maester Ronald, an older man with a pinched face and watery eyes, studied Sam with keen interest. "You have an interesting claim, Samwell Tarly. House Tarly was well respected, and if you intend to press your right as your father's heir, you may well gather men to your cause. But do you have the will for it? Leading men to rebellion is no small thing. Sam felt a tremor in his hands. He hid them beneath the folds of his cloak. I don't want war, he said carefully, but I cannot stand by and watch more innocents suffer without cause. There's no reason to be sending armies against the people. They've had enough war. Everyone has had enough war. If the crown wants to crush dissent in the Reach, I fear it will cost thousands of lives. But if someone can stand as a banner for the discontent, if we can gather enough support to force negotiations, to oust a tyrant without letting the entire land burn. Ronald arched a brow. You speak of ousting a king as though it's a matter for polite discussion. That may not be so simple. One of the younger acolytes, who was sorting scrolls, cut in. But it's not entirely unprecedented. The realm has seen how a single name, Stark, Targaryen, Baratheon, can unite men. House Tarly once stood among the greatest in the Reach. Besides, the Tarly sword is legendary. The small folk still remember Heartsbane. Sam looked at the young man. I know, but I need more than a sword. I need allies. And beyond that, I need to do it in a way that doesn't become yet another slaughter. Ronald gave a resigned sigh. If you truly mean to do this, Samwell, you should leave the Citadel. The Archmasters will not openly condone rebellion, nor will they intervene to stop it unless it threatens their immediate interests. We try to remain neutral in these matters, after all. But some of us, and here his voice grew softer, some of us believe that a learned man in a position of lordly power might bring a measure of stability the realm so desperately needs. Sam bowed his head. Thank you for your honesty, Maester Ronald. I understand. I won't drag the Citadel into this. But I must go to Horn Hill. It belongs to me by right, and if there's a chance to rally good men to defend themselves against oppression, I can't turn away. And so it was decided. Sam made preparations quietly. Gilly would stay behind, at least until Sam had a measure of the situation in Horn Hill. He wanted her safe, away from the first flames of rebellion. She agreed, albeit reluctantly, for she had grown fiercely loyal to him, but she also understood the danger. With heavy heart, Sam parted from her, pressing a kiss to her forehead and to the boys. He donned a plain cloak, but under it he wore a worn leather sword belt with Heartsbane at his side. It felt heavier than any weight he had carried, but it also felt strangely right. He was Samwell Tarly, a man of the Night's Watch once, but also the heir of Horn Hill. The two identities warred within him, but he pressed forward, determined. He set out for Horn Hill on a sturdy mare borrowed from the stables outside Old Town. He took a circuitous route, avoiding the main roads that might be patrolled by roving men loyal to the crown. The fields of the Reach, once so bountiful and lush, lay scarred in places by battles of prior years. The farmers he passed seemed weary, glancing with suspicion at any armed man. Some recognized the sigil on the sword's pommel or recognized Sam's face from years past, but none cried alarm. A few touched their foreheads in a gesture of respect when they recognized Heartsbane. They said nothing, though, and Sam kept his gaze lowered. It was not yet time to announce himself. Not until he reached Horn Hill, the seat of his ancestors, the place he had once loved and feared with equal measure. When at last the battlements came into view, Sam felt his chest tighten with emotion. The high walls, the watchtowers, the green fields stretching below. Memories flooded him of a childhood overshadowed by a stern father and the humiliation of repeated failures with sword and lance. Horn Hill had been both home and torment, yet now it appeared half-abandoned. The outer gates stood unrepaired from some earlier conflict. Weeds grew where once there had been carefully maintained gardens. The banner of House Tarly was not even in evidence. Instead, a ragged piece of cloth that might have once borne the sigil drooped from the highest tower. Sam announced himself at the gates. The guards, a mere pair of men who looked ragged and malnourished, squinted at him. One's eyes widened at the mention of Sam's name and at the sight of Heartsbane strapped across his back. They let him pass without delay, bowing slightly. The courtyard was strangely empty, echoing with the ghosts of times long gone. Some servants peered from within doorways, confusion plain on their faces. Others whispered among themselves. By the time Sam reached the main hall, a small crowd had gathered, uncertain but curious. He dismounted and looked around. It struck him how different Horn Hill felt without the commanding presence of Randall Tarley. He had expected more men, more arms, more life. Instead, it felt as though the entire estate were on the brink of collapse. He took a breath and raised his voice as best he could. "I am Samuel Tarley, son of Randall Tarley. I have come to claim my birthright and to restore House Tarley." He felt the words vibrate in the air, sounding foreign on his own tongue. A murmur ran through the onlookers. Some wore expressions of relief, others seemed wary, and a few looked at him with outright doubt. A tall man stepped forward, who introduced himself as Garrett, a sworn sword once in service to Dickon Tarley. Garrett's face was etched with lines of worry and exhaustion. He bowed to Sam, albeit stiffly. "My lord," or "Samwell, your father is dead, and your brother too. There are no other claimants, so by right, you are indeed the Lord of Horn Hill. But we have little left to offer. The crown took much, and men with hungry bellies have been making off with the small stores that remain." Sam nodded solemnly. "I understand. I did not come seeking riches. I came because I fear the new occupant of the Iron Throne will soon turn its gaze here, to punish the disloyal or to demand more taxes and men. We have to prepare. But first, we must see to the immediate needs of the people." "How bad is the situation?" Garrett studied him with a hint of skepticism. "There are fewer than 50 men still sworn to House Tarley who remain on the grounds. Most have scattered to their kin or been taken into other lords' service. The small folk in the surrounding lands struggle to bring in the harvest, but the crown's men demand a large portion of the yield. Many fear that a new war will break out. We had thought House Tarley was finished." Sam felt his heart sink. To stage any kind of rebellion would require far more than 50 men. Still, there was more to the Tarley name than who happened to dwell in Horn Hill at that moment. "I don't want war," Sam said firmly. "We must protect ourselves and our people. I will not bow to a tyrant who punishes loyal men without cause. If we must gather swords and stand for the Reach, let it be so. But first, we must gather the harvest, ensure everyone is fed, and begin to repair the walls. We need to see Horn Hill strong again." So began his labor. For days, Sam listened more than he spoke. He gathered old retainers who knew the intricacies of stewardship, farmland distribution, and local politics. He wrote letters, personally, to small folk in the outlying villages, inviting them to come to Horn Hill for a rededication ceremony of House Tarley's seat. He pledged fair distribution of supplies from the estate stores. He bartered with traveling merchants, promising to pay them fairly for grain and seed if they would accept future harvest yields or promissory notes from Horn Hill's treasury. At first, many were skeptical. Sam Tarley was an untested lord, rumored to have worn black and run from his father. But as word spread that Heartsbane was once more in Horn Hill, that the trueborn heir had returned not with demands but with promises of fair treatment, the tide began to turn. Small folk trickled in. They brought as many supplies as they could spare. Some men, older and younger alike, offered their service if Sam would pay them a fair wage or ensure they had enough to feed their families. Sam exhausted the small coffers that remained to House Tarley to do just that. The repairs to the gates and walls were slow, but more hands meant the work progressed. Sam spent hours among the laborers, sleeves rolled up, sweat coating his brow, hauling stones or mixing mortar. Even if he had no talent with a sword, he was not entirely useless physically. He was round, yes, but strong enough in the arms to lift a load of bricks if he put his mind to it. The men respected that. More than one whispered that Lord Randall would never have done such a thing, never stooped to help commoners with manual labor. But Sam did. A few of the Tarley knights who had wandered off to serve other lords returned, curious to see if the rumors were true. Ser Ingvar, a knight well past his prime but with a storied career, arrived on a drab mare, wearing worn plate. He bowed before Sam in the courtyard. "My lord," he said, Your father and I parted ways years ago, but I always served House Tarly. If it's true you plan to restore Horn Hill, you'll need knights to train new recruits. I offer my sword if you will have it." Sam regarded him with gratitude. "Ser Ingvar, I remember you from my childhood. You taught my brother his sword forms. I would be honored to have you here." And so, step by step, Horn Hill regained a semblance of life. Of course, it was not enough to withstand an assault by a serious army. But with the crown's forces spread thin across the realm, and conflicts brewing elsewhere, Sam hoped to remain beneath notice for a time, long enough to gather strength and foster alliances. He wrote letters to other lords of the Reach, to the Hightowers of Old Town, to what remained of House Redwine, to minor houses like the Mullendores, the Beesburys, the Florence, the Oakharts. He appealed to the name of Tarly, to the Han, or of the Reach, and to the cause of preserving their lands from a monarch who taxed them beyond reason. He asked for support, trade, men, or even just neutrality if the crown came calling. Responses trickled in over the course of weeks. Some refused outright. The Florence sent a curt note that said the Tarly name was tainted by Randall's unwise decisions, and they would not risk open defiance of the Iron Throne. Some wrote politely, offering vague pleasantries but no promises. A precious few expressed genuine interest. One letter from Lady Brylan Oakhart was particularly encouraging. She hinted that if Sam declared open opposition to the crown, she might be persuaded to send a contingent of knights to Horn Hill. Another came from the Hightowers, with more caution in their tone, but still inviting Sam to meet for a discussion in Old Town. They wrote that the city's position was precarious, officially loyal to the crown, but sympathetic to the plight of the realm's overtaxed smallfolk. Amid these diplomatic maneuvers, Sam found himself faced with the reality that, if negotiations failed, swords would be drawn. He had no illusions that he could best any knight in single combat or lead a cavalry charge from the front lines. But he also could not in good conscience remain a figurehead, issuing orders from behind a desk. The men needed to see him trying, stepping up as their lord. So, in the battered courtyard of Horn Hill, Sam began to train under Ser Ingvar's guidance. He used Heartsbane. The first time he lifted the Valyrian steel for actual sparring, the Watchers whispered among themselves. Many recalled stories of how Randall Tarly wielded that blade with lethal precision. But Sam's posture was shaky, uncertain. Ser Ingvar's was gentle but firm. "My lord, you must trust the sword. It's lighter than common steel, more agile in the hand. Let it guide you." Sam tried, but he stumbled. He sweated profusely, panting after just a few passes. His old insecurities rose, but he pressed on. Every day he would train a bit, and every day he learned more about footwork, about how to block and parry, about how to read an opponent. He might never become the warrior his father wanted, but he started to resemble something that might pass for a man who could stand on a battlefield without fleeing in terror. The men noticed and quietly offered him encouragement. When not training, Sam worked closely with the household staff to prepare the fortress for a possible siege. They began storing grain, salting meat, and building up a modest stable of horses. They forged alliances with traveling merchants who might bypass the crown's watchers. Little by little, Horn Hill awakened from its slumber, reasserting itself as a seat of power, and Sam was at its center forging a plan. He had not openly declared rebellion yet. He was careful. The crown spies were everywhere, and if the king or queen learned that Samwell Tarly was gathering an army, they might launch a preemptive strike. Sam wanted first to build a strong enough position so that the crown might think twice about a direct assault. That required alliances, men-at-arms, and resources. The choice became clearer when official word reached Horn Hill in the form of a royal messenger, who arrived on a lathered horse with a scroll sealed in the crown's crest. The man delivered it to Sam in the Great Hall with a nervous bow. Sam, flanked by Garrett and Ser Ingvar, broke the seal and read the message aloud. By order of the crown, all lords of the Reach are required to raise levies to aid in the subjugation of newly rebellious lands in the Stormlands. Each house must offer a tithe of coin and harvest to support the crown's campaigns. Failure to comply will be considered treason. Further, all lords are to present themselves at King's Landing within a fortnight to swear renewed fealty. Sam set the parchment down. He exchanged a long look with Garrett and Ser Ingvar. The assembled men in the hall murmured uneasily. They had no great store of coin or harvest to give. Even if they did, was it right to send men to die in a campaign that had no purpose but the crown's ambitions? He looked at the messenger. "Tell your master that Samuel Tarley of Horn Hill acknowledges receipt of this command. I will consider it and respond in kind. For now, rest, eat, and return on the morrow." The messenger, looking relieved at Sam's politeness, was escorted away. Once the hall was empty, Sam exhaled. "A fortnight," he said quietly. "They'll expect me to appear in King's Landing. If I don't, they'll brand me traitor." Ser Ingvar nodded grimly. "And if you go, they'll demand men, coin, and fealty. If you refuse, you'll be arrested or worse." Garrett spat. "We can't comply, not with so little left to us. The small folk will starve." Sam's mind whirled. He felt the old fear rising, threatening to paralyze him. But he refused to let it. Instead, he spoke calmly. "We must gather our allies quickly. If the crown wants to strip the Reach further, we won't be the only ones who object. I will send ravens tonight to Lady Brylan Oakhart, to the Hightowers, and to any who might stand with us." And that was the moment Sam chose to commit to his path. He began drafting letters, not mere polite requests but urgent calls to arms. He wrote openly of the crown's tyranny, of the cruelty that demanded more from a region already decimated by wars. He invoked the name of the Tarleys and the right of the Reach to stand proud. He promised fair distribution of spoils if victory was won, and he pledged to keep the war from ravaging the farmland if at all possible. He ended each letter with the final line, "Join me in defending our homes and our dignity. I offer you my word as a Tarley, and the blade Heartsbane shall be our witness." It was bold, dangerously so, but Sam knew that once the messenger left, the crown would suspect him anyway. Better to act decisively than to wait for the hammer to fall. Ravens flew from Horn Hill in all directions, carrying Sam's plea. Then he waited, the anxious days stretching out as he prepared as best he could for the worst. Within a few days, the first responses arrived. Lady Brylan Oakhart sent word that she would muster 200 men and march to Horn Hill to join Sam's cause. A minor house, House Meadows, wrote to say they would send 50 archers. A few others offered to remain neutral but provide supplies. Encouraging news, though still modest in scale. The Hightowers had not yet responded, which worried Sam. The greatest city in the Reach, Old Town, and House Hightower support or rejection could tip the scales. But time was short. Sam took what he could get. As the fortnight neared its end, Lady Brylan Oakhart arrived at Horn Hill. She was not a young woman, but she carried herself with poise, wearing armor that had been fitted to her tall frame. Her standard-bearers hoisted the green oak leaf of her house. Her men were a disciplined lot, if not vast in number. When she arrived in the courtyard, Sam greeted her in person. She dismounted gracefully and offered him a measured smile. "My Lord Tarley," she said, "I hope we have not come too late." Sam bowed. "My lady, you have come at exactly the right time. We are grateful for your support. I fear the crown will not be long in responding." She cast a quick glance around, appraising the garrison, the newly repaired walls, the tension in the air. "We may be outnumbered, but the men are eager to defend their lands from tyranny. My knights will stand with you." Sam thanked her. They spent the evening discussing strategy with Garrett and Ser Ingvar. They reasoned that the crown might send a small force first, a show of strength to intimidate them into surrender before a larger host arrived. If that happened, they could try to repel the initial force and then negotiate, hoping that the crown would realize the cost of a full-scale assault was too high. Alternatively, the crown might gather a massive host from the Crownlands and Stormlands, plus any loyal Reach houses, to crush Horn Hill quickly, making an example of Sam. The difference would lie in how many houses Sam could rally before that happened. And so they waited. Another day passed, then another. On the dawn of the day Sam was supposed to present himself in King's Landing, word came from a sentry atop the watchtower. A small column of riders, bearing the crown's banner, was approaching. At the same time, a raven arrived from the high towers. Sam read it with trembling fingers. It was short but decisive. To Samuel Tarley, heir of Horn Hill, House Hightower stands for the traditions and prosperity of Old Town and the Reach. We cannot abide the further oppression of our people. You shall have our aid, but it will take time to muster. Hold Horn Hill, and you shall not stand alone. Signed, Lord Mallador Hightower. Sam felt a rush of relief, immediately tempered by the knowledge that time to muster could mean days or weeks. Time they might not have, but still it was the best news he could have hoped for. He tucked the letter away and prepared to meet the crown's envoy. They came in a line of about 50 mounted men, led by a knight wearing the crown's sigil, which had shifted with the new occupant of the throne. A stylized golden dragon with a black background, though everyone knew the king's Targaryen ties were questionable. The knight, flanked by men-at-arms, halted before the gate. Sam, with Ser Ingvar and Lady Oakhart, walked out to meet them. Archers lined the walls discreetly, watchful. Sam's heart hammered in his chest as he faced the newcomers. The knight's helmet bore a dragon crest. He lifted the visor, revealing a stern face with narrow eyes. "Samuel Tarley," he called, voice cold. "The crown demands your presence in King's Landing. Are you prepared to ride at once?" Sam clenched his fists at his sides, then forced himself to speak calmly. "I regret I cannot answer that summons. Horn Hill has too many obligations that require my presence." The knight sneered. "Then you name yourself a traitor. I come with the authority of his grace, the king. You will present your men for the crown's campaign, your coin, and your harvest. Fail to do so, and Horn Hill will be put to the torch." A murmur went through the onlookers. Sam's breath quickened. He forced his voice to remain steady. "This land has suffered too many wars already. The crown's demands are unreasonable. We cannot pay what we do not have. We will not send men to a war that does not concern the Reach. Inform your king that we wish for peace, but we will fight if threatened." The knight's lip curled in disdain. He glanced at Lady Oakhart's men, at the archers on the walls, at Sam's sword belt where Heartsbane was visible. A flicker of something crossed his face. Unease, perhaps, but he quickly hardened it into a look of contempt. "You have chosen rebellion, then. So be it. We will return with an army, and we will see if your feeble garrison can stop us. I had hoped you would have the sense to submit, but clearly your father's discipline did not teach you well." Sam felt the sting of the remark. He gripped Heartsbane's hilt. "My father taught me many lessons. One of them was that the duty of a lord is to protect his people. I will do that no matter the cost." The knight gave a harsh laugh. "You're a fool, Samuel Tarley. When the crown's host arrives, none of your fancy words will save you." With that, he wheeled his horse and galloped away, his men forming up behind him. They left a trail of dust as they disappeared into the distance. Sam exhaled shakily. He felt Lady Oakhart's hand on his shoulder. She spoke softly. "There's no turning back now. War is upon us." He nodded, fear curdling in his belly. "We have to prepare, and we must hope the Hightowers come in time." From that moment, Horn Hill became a fortress preparing for battle. Men sharpened blades, constructed barricades, practiced archery in the fields. Sam ordered that all who could bear arms be trained, including farmers from nearby lands who had taken shelter in Horn Hill. Lady Oakhart's soldiers proved invaluable in drilling them, and Ser Ingvar directed the defense of the walls. Sam spent long nights in the library, poring over old texts and maps that described siege tactics. He penned more letters, dispatching ravens to the Hightowers and any other house that might come to their aid. Days stretched into a tense week. Refugees from outlying villages arrived, fleeing rumors of the crown's troops pillaging the countryside for supplies. Sam welcomed them, offering what little shelter Horn Hill could spare. The fortress became crowded, but Sam refused to turn anyone away. Some of the older folk recalled how Randall Tarley would have likely denied them entry, calling them useless mouths in time of war. But Sam was not his father. That knowledge alone brought him a measure of resolve he had never known before. Then, one morning, the horns atop Horn Hill sounded an alarm. A scout had spotted a dust cloud on the horizon, the telltale sign of an approaching army. Archers hurried to their posts. Knights strapped on armor. Peasants fumbled with spears. Sam climbed to the battlements to see for himself. In the distance, he saw banners, black on gold, the crest of the new Targaryen king. The host looked to number perhaps 1,000 men, maybe more, far outnumbering Sam's meager force of a few hundred. Sam's throat went dry. Beside him, Lady Oakheart cursed under her breath. Ser Ingvar frowned. "We have the walls, my lord," he said quietly. "We can hold them off for a time. But if they bring siege engines, or if they starve us out, we won't last long unless we receive reinforcements." Sam gripped the stone merlin, scanning the horizon for any sign of friendly banners. Perhaps the Hightowers, or another house that might have decided to join. There was nothing. "We'll hold as long as we can," Sam said. "And perhaps we can parley. If they see a stubborn defense, maybe they'll offer terms." They made ready. As the crown's host drew nearer, Sam and his companions waited behind the gate with archers on the walls. The day was bright, the sun reflecting off the armor of the attacking force. Eventually, a small party of riders approached within earshot. Sam stood on the ramparts, calling down to them. Among them, he recognized the knight who had delivered the crown's ultimatum before. "We have come to accept your surrender," the knight shouted. "Open your gates, lay down your arms, and submit. Lord Samwell Tarly may yet be permitted to keep his life, if he bends the knee before the king. Otherwise, we begin our assault at once, and no mercy will be shown." Sam took a shaky breath. He glanced at Lady Oakheart, who shook her head, lips pressed in a grim line. He thought of all the people crammed inside Horn Hill, the families, the farmers, those who came seeking protection from tyranny. If he yielded, perhaps he could spare them from a brutal siege. But would the crown truly show mercy, or would they punish them, strip the lands bare, and set an even harsher lord in his place? His father's voice seemed to echo in his mind, unbidden, but for once it carried a different meaning. A lord protects his people. Sam straightened his shoulders. "This is the seat of House Tarly," he called, voice carrying across the field. "We mean no harm to anyone, but we will not bend to a tyrant. If you begin an assault, we will defend ourselves." The knight spat in the dirt. "Then you'll die. Archers." Sam ducked behind the crenellations as a volley of arrows hissed through the air. He heard screams from behind him as some found their mark. The siege had begun. Quickly, Horn Hill's archers returned fire, loosing arrows at the crown's men. The courtyard bustled with frantic shouting as defenders scrambled. Sam forced himself to remain on the walls, to show that he would not abandon them. Lady Oakheart was at his side, calling commands. Ser Ingvar bellowed for the men to hold steady, to conserve arrows until the attackers were within range. The first few hours were a flurry of arrows and sporadic attempts by the crown's infantry to approach the walls. The thick walls and the defenders' archery kept them at bay. Sam saw a few fallen men near the moat that surrounded Horn Hill, but the crown's forces mostly hung back, evidently waiting for instructions or siege engines to arrive. Then a horn blew in the distance, and Sam realized they had brought catapults or scorpions. By midday, stones began crashing into the outer structures, smashing small parts of the curtain wall. The defenders struggled to return fire, but their supply of heavy projectiles was limited. Sam cursed under his breath. No matter how valiantly they fought, they were at a disadvantage. The crown's men had the numbers and the tools. Horn Hill's newly repaired walls might not stand up to a sustained bombardment. Still, they held. The day dragged on, the sun beating down mercilessly. The heat, the clang of steel, the whistle of arrows. It was chaos. Sam found himself shouting instructions he had gleaned from old siege texts. He directed men to reinforce weak points in the wall, to douse flames that erupted whenever a flaming arrow struck. The crown's host surged forward in a testing wave, trying to storm the gates, but Lady Oakheart's knights hurled them back with arrows and boiling water from the battlements. For a moment, Sam felt a surge of hope. Perhaps they could repel them indefinitely. But as evening approached, it became evident that the Crown's men were simply testing defenses, not yet committing to a full assault. Night fell, bringing a reprieve of sorts. Both sides settled into a tense watch, the defenders exhausted, the attackers wary of mounting a night assault. Sam walked the walls, stepping past the wounded men lying on makeshift pallets. The moans and cries of pain gnawed at him. He knelt by one young archer who had an arrow lodged in his thigh, offering shaky encouragement. The boy, perhaps 15, looked at Sam with tears in his eyes. "Am I going to die, my lord?" Sam swallowed the lump in his throat. He placed a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. "We have a maester to tend to you. You'll be all right. Rest now." But Sam had no maester, just a few learned men, none with enough skill to remove an arrow lodged so deep. The boy might well lose the leg, if not his life. Leaving the young archer in the care of the best volunteer medics they had, Sam retreated to the keep. He found Lady Oakheart there, wiping blood from her sword. Her face was lined with weariness. "They're going to starve us out if they can't storm the walls soon," she said quietly. "We have enough provisions for a couple of weeks, but no more." Sam nodded grimly. "I'm hoping the Hightowers arrive before then." "And if they don't?" she pressed. Sam lowered his gaze. "We'll have to make a stand, or attempt a sortie. Neither option is good. I don't want to lead these men to slaughter." She laid a hand on his arm. "You've done what you could. Many in your position would have yielded the moment that army appeared. You've shown a backbone. Sometimes that's all that's needed to inspire others." He tried to find solace in that, but the night was long and sleepless. The next morning, the Crown's siege continued. Stones battered the walls, archers exchanged volleys, and casualties mounted on both sides. By midday, the Crown's men had managed to establish a forward camp out of range of Hornhill's archers, setting up tents and siege equipment. Sam watched from a tower, despair growing, as they methodically placed larger catapults. That evening, a second wave of attack came. The Crown's foot soldiers rushed the walls, employ ing ladders and grappling hooks. Hornhill's defenders fought valiantly, pushing ladders away, shooting down climbers, but the sheer number of attackers threatened to overwhelm. Sam found himself on the ramparts, Heartsbane drawn, beside Ser Ingvar, who barked orders to the men. When an enemy soldier managed to crest the wall, Sam swung the Valyrian steel clumsily. He was not graceful, but he caught the soldier in the side. The blade passed through steel plate as if it were cloth. Blood sprayed and the soldier toppled. Sam stood stunned, panting, heart pounding with horror. He had killed a man. The first time he had taken a human life. His stomach churned, but there was no time to dwell on it. Another soldier scrambled up the battlement, and Sam had to parry desperately, stumbling backward. Ser Ingvar stepped in to dispatch the foe, pressing them back over the wall. They fought for what felt like hours, the cacophony of battle ringing in Sam's ears. Eventually, the Crown's men retreated, leaving more dead behind. Hornhill's defenders cheered in exhaustion. Sam collapsed to his knees, trembling, the reality of killing a man hitting him in a wave of nausea. Lady Oakheart knelt next to him, hand on his back. She spoke softly, so only he could hear. "Breathe, Samwell. You did what you had to do. Don't lose yourself now." He vomited over the side of the rampart, tears burning his eyes. War was horror. He had known it in theory, read of it in dusty tomes, but living it was another matter entirely. The men around him cheered in relief to have driven off the assault, but they all knew this was only a fraction of the Crown's strength. Another assault would come in time. The next 2 days followed a similar pattern. Bombardment by day, attempts at the walls by evening, rest by night. Hornhill's defenders grew wearier and fewer. The Crown's forces suffered losses too, but they had more men, more resources. By the third day, Sam was certain that they could not last another week. Rations were already being strictly allocated, and the walls bore gaping cracks from repeated catapult hits. On the morning of the fourth day, Sam stood atop the gatehouse, scanning the horizon as he did every morning. The Crown's army was there, encamped, But something beyond them caught his eye. A swirl of dust, faint at first, but growing. He squinted, heart fluttering. Could it be? He ordered a sentry to fetch the Myrish lens from the keep. Gazing through it, he saw banners. High tower banners. A large force. Cavalry, too, from the dust. Relief flooded him, mingled with a renewed fear that it might be too small or might arrive too late. Within the hour, the Crown's camp stirred, aware that another army was approaching. In the distance, Sam saw the flash of steel as Hightower knights rode at full gallop toward the Crown's flank. Then horns blared, and the Crown's men scrambled into formation. The clash began far from Horn Hill's walls, but Sam could see the banners and dust swirl as cavalry slammed into foot soldiers. The Crown's army, forced to fight on two fronts, began pulling men from the siege lines to repel the Hightowers. Seizing the moment, Sam ordered Lady Oakhart and Ser Ingvar to lead a sally from the gates, hoping to catch the Crown's forces in the rear while they were busy. The gates opened, and a contingent of knights and spearmen poured forth from Horn Hill, Sam among them. His heart hammered with terror, but he forced himself to ride with the men. They crashed into the Crown's lines, cutting down archers and engineers who had been manning the siege engines. Sam wielded Heartsbane, though he tried to stay near Ser Ingvar, who guided him through the chaos. The Crown's men, caught off guard, scattered for a moment. Then the lines reformed, and a pitched battle erupted across the plain before Horn Hill's gates. Everything blurred for Sam. The shouts, the clang of steel, the shrieks of horses, the reek of blood. But he focused on what needed to be done. He saw a Crown officer rallying men behind a catapult. Summoning what courage he had, Sam kicked his horse forward and swung Heartsbane. The man saw the blade and raised his shield, but the Valyrian steel cleaved through shield and mail, dropping him instantly. Sam reined in his horse, heart in his throat, half in shock at what he'd just done. Then he advanced, urging the men forward. He was no shining knight, but the sight of a Tarly leading the charge inspired them. They pressed on, capturing or destroying the siege equipment. Meanwhile, the Hightower cavalry hammered the Crown's flanks. Another host of infantry marched in behind them, bearing the tall white towers on their banners. The Crown's lines wavered, men fleeing or falling back. The Crown's knight who had delivered the ultimatum to Sam found himself surrounded by Lady Oakhart's knights. Sam saw him from a distance, recognized the dragon crest on his helm. The man shouted curses and defiance, swinging his sword with desperation. He struck down one Oakhart knight, mortally wounding him, but was run through by another's lance. With their commanding officers dead or captured, the Crown's men lost coherence. They began to rout. Some threw down their arms and surrendered. Others fled into the countryside. By midday, the battle was clearly won. The Hightowers had arrived in substantial force, tipping the scales. Horn Hill's defenders, battered and bruised, found themselves victors. Sam called for mercy to be shown to prisoners. He wanted to set a different example than his father might have. The field was strewn with corpses, a grim testament to the cost of defiance. Sam felt no elation, only relief and a hollow sorrow at the carnage. Still, they had accomplished what few thought possible. They had defied the Crown and survived. In the aftermath, Lord Malador Hightower rode up to Sam. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, clad in plate armor dented from the fighting. He removed his helm, revealing sweat-slicked hair and a stern but not unkind face. "Lord Tarly," he said, "we answered your call. Apologies for not arriving sooner." Sam bowed his head respectfully. "You arrived exactly when we needed you, my lord." "Thank you." Malador glanced at the gore and ruin around them. "This battle may be done, but you realize the Crown will not let this pass easily." Sam nodded. "Yes, but we've shown them we can stand together. Perhaps that will make them think twice before sending a larger host." Lady Oakhart joined them, brushing back a lock of hair matted with dust and blood. "We must seize the momentum. If we remain passive, the Crown will regroup and come at us with a bigger army. We need to unify the reach." Malador studied her, then Sam. We could call a council of lords to declare an alliance. If enough houses join us, we can form a coalition strong enough to resist the crown's aggression. Sam swallowed. The notion of open rebellion, not just a localized defense, was daunting. But he thought of the small folk and how they would suffer if the crown returned with vengeance. "We will host it at Horn Hill," he said. "We will invite every house of the Reach, great or small. We'll ask them to stand with us, to protect our lands from a king who does not respect us." Malidor nodded. "Very well. We'll begin sending ravens immediately." The knights parted ways to see to their men, to treat the wounded, and to bury the dead. Sam lingered, gazing out over the battlefield with a heavy heart. He had raised Heartsbane, rallied the men, and now the crown's army lay shattered before Horn Hill's gates. It was a victory, but also a promise of further conflict. The realm might plunge into another war. Bloodshed might spread. Yet he had chosen this course because he could not abide tyranny. He wondered if he was doing the right thing. That evening, after the fallen were tended to, Sam retreated to a quiet corner of the keep. He laid Heartsbane on a table, staring at its polished edge. He remembered how it felt to plunge that blade into living men. He recalled the White Walker he had killed beyond the wall. Strange, how that had once seemed the greatest horror he could face. Yet fighting fellow men felt infinitely more tragic. Gilly came to his mind. He longed for her presence, for her gentle voice to soothe him. He thought of sending for her, but hesitated. This was no place for the family he loved, not while war loomed. So he waited, cradling the sword's hilt, and in his mind he whispered an apology to every soul lost in the day's battle. When the dawn came, Horn Hill rose to the sobering task of cleaning the battlefield. The stench of death filled the air, and Sam accompanied the men burying the bodies of friend and foe alike. More refugees arrived from nearby hamlets, lured by the hope of protection. Malidor Hightower took stock of the crown's captured supplies, food, weapons, a few wagons. This would help sustain Horn Hill for a while, but the question remained, how many more battles would it take to force the crown to relent? Sam wrote new letters, announcing the victory to all the lords of the Reach. He invited them to send representatives to Horn Hill to discuss a unified stance. Some might not come. Some might be swayed by the crown's threat. But in the wake of this victory, there was hope that more would join than not. Perhaps they could forge a coalition strong enough to end the king's tyranny without further devastation. Perhaps, over the following week, men trickled in from other houses. Some envoys, some knights, some lords themselves. They came bearing their house sigils. The green hand of the Gardner line was long gone, but the spirit of the Reach lived on in Oakhart, Rowan, Beesbury, Mullendore, Costane, and others. They gathered in Horn Hill's great hall, a place once so dominated by Randall Tarley's presence. Now Sam Tarley stood at the head of the table. Though he wore no crown, there was a certain solemn gravity to him that he never thought he could possess. Heartsbane hung at his side, a silent reminder of the legacy he carried. He addressed the assembly. "My lords and ladies, we have all suffered under the crown's demands. We do not seek to take the Iron Throne. We do not seek to overthrow the entire realm. What we seek is freedom from oppression for the Reach, for our lands and our people to prosper without being taxed into ruin and sent to fight senseless wars. If the crown will not grant us that peace, we will fight together. I ask you to stand with me, to stand with House Hightower, House Oakhart, and the others who have pledged their swords. We are stronger together than divided." Lady Brylan Oakhart spoke up, recounting the recent battle and how Horn Hill, though outnumbered, had stood firm until the Hightowers arrived. Lord Malidor Hightower added that Old Town itself would not bow to a tyrant who threatened their trade and cultural heritage. Other lords voiced their grievances. Some worried about retribution from the crown. Others insisted that unless they acted now, the next wave of war would break upon them soon enough. "At least if we unite," they said, "we stand a chance of dictating terms rather than submitting." After much debate, a consensus began to form. They would not call themselves an independent kingdom, nor would they claim the right to choose another king. Instead, they declared themselves the League of the Reach, forging a mutual defense pact. They wrote a formal document, stating that any aggression from the crown would be met by the collective forces of the signatories. If the crown recognized their autonomy and eased its demands, they would remain part of the Seven Kingdoms in peace. If not, war would follow. Each house stamped its seal or mark upon the parchment, in front of Sam Tarly and Malador Hightower. Not all houses of the Reach signed, but enough to form a substantial coalition. Sam oversaw the signing with a trembling sense of awe. He thought of the boy he had been, afraid of swords, afraid of his father, afraid of everything. And now here he stood, forging an alliance that might change the face of the realm. When the final seal was placed on the parchment, the hall erupted in applause, but Sam merely closed his eyes, hoping this would not lead to more bloodshed than they could bear. That night, the Allied leaders gathered for a simple meal. They toasted their newfound cause, with cups of arbor wine that had been brought by a red wine envoy. Sam drank sparingly, mindful of the responsibility he bore. When the feast ended and he found himself alone in the hall, Malador Hightower approached him. The older lord spoke quietly. "You've done something remarkable here, Lord Tarly. Let us pray the crown sees sense." Sam managed a weary smile. "If they don't," Malador exhaled, "then we'll fight. We'll defend ourselves. But we have a chance now. With Old Town committed and so many houses on board, the crown cannot easily crush us. They may seek negotiation." Sam nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. The crown might well try to muster an even larger army, or make deals with foreign powers to bring sellswords across the sea. They might attempt subterfuge, assassinations, political maneuvering, any number of possibilities. And Sam, for all his reading and study, was new to the cutthroat game of Westerosi politics. He only knew he had no choice but to continue. The alternative was surrender, or abandoning the people who had put their trust in him. A few days later, a raven arrived from King's Landing. It bore the royal seal and was addressed to Samwell Tarly, traitor and usurper. Sam read it aloud to the lords in the Great Hall. "To Samwell Tarly, who styles himself Lord of Horn Hill, you stand accused of high treason against the crown, having taken arms against royal forces, shedding the blood of loyal soldiers, and forging an unlawful alliance of discontented vassals. The realm shall not abide such insolence. You and any who support you shall be named traitors, and your lands forfeit, unless you disband your forces and present yourself for judgment in King's Landing within 10 days. The crown's army marches, and no quarter shall be given to traitors who persist in rebellion. Thus decreed by the king, rightful heir to the Iron Throne." The assembled lords stirred angrily. Lady Oakhart spat on the floor, muttering curses. Malador Hightower's face was set in grim lines. One of the minor lords asked, "Do they truly think we will just hand ourselves over to be executed?" Sam set the letter aside. He cleared his throat, addressing the gathering. "We are all traitors now in the crown's eyes. This is our moment of truth. We can stand together or crumble separately. We will send a reply, stating that the League of the Reach stands by its pledge. We shall defend ourselves, and we are willing to discuss peace terms if the crown retracts its demands." The lords agreed. They drafted a response under Sam's guidance, carefully wording it to emphasize their desire for a peaceful resolution while refusing to surrender. Sam took special care to mention that they would permit a royal envoy to come in safety to Horn Hill for negotiations, if desired. When the raven flew, the hall buzzed with anxiety. Some lords looked to Sam Tarly as if he held all the answers. He felt the weight acutely but tried not to let it crush him. He reminded himself that he was not alone. Lady Oakhart, Malador Hightower, and others had equal shares in this endeavor. In the days that followed, they bolstered their positions, planning for the arrival of a crown host that might dwarf what they had already faced. The men of the Reach began training in earnest. House Hightower, one of the richest houses in Westeros, used its coffers to hire sellswords, to purchase better weapons, and to fortify strategic points. Old Town thrummed with activity, forging alliances with merchant guilds that wanted protection from the crown's uncertain policies. Sam found himself presiding over these councils, though he always deferred to more experienced knights when it came to military tactics. He used his knowledge of ravens and communication to ensure that the League could coordinate quickly across the region. Scouts and riders were posted along the main roads to watch for the crown's approach. By all accounts, a larger army was indeed gathering in King's Landing, but it would take time for them to march south and assemble supply lines. The crown's capacity for waging war was formidable, but the League of the Reach had no shortage of farmland and resources if they could manage to keep their territory from invasion. Through it all, Sam wrote to Gilly, telling her of the events, though he spared her the details of the bloodshed. He missed her terribly, but this was no place for her now. He promised her that if war intensified, he would send for her only when he could ensure her safety. Privately, he wondered if he was dooming them all to a lifetime of conflict. But a small voice inside him, the same voice that had urged him to take Heartsbane from Horn Hill, reminded him that sometimes one must make a stand for what is right, however daunting. Then came a flicker of hope. A royal envoy arrived under a flag of truce. The party included a highborn lady rumored to be a cousin of the king, accompanied by several knights. They rode cautiously to Horn Hill's gates, where Sam and the allied lords received them in the courtyard, heavily guarded. Sam was struck by how young the lady appeared, scarcely older than a girl, though her eyes were sharp. She introduced herself as Lady Elora Waters, and she carried an ornate letter from the king, offering to negotiate the League of the Reach's demands. She spoke in measured tones, acknowledging the complexities. "The king does not wish to see the realm torn apart again by civil war," she said. "He invites representatives of the Reach to come to King's Landing and discuss a fair arrangement." Lady Oakhart demanded to know why the previous letter threatened no quarter. Lady Elora Waters demurred, explaining that the king's anger had cooled upon hearing news of the League's size and unity. Perhaps the crown realized that an open war with the entire Reach might be a costly gamble, especially with the Stormlands and Riverlands rumored to be restless as well. Perhaps the crown felt it could placate the Reach with some concessions. It was decided. Sam Tarley, Malador Hightower, and Lady Oakhart would travel under safe conduct to King's Landing to treat with the crown. The other lords would remain in the Reach with their armies ready, in case this was a trap. Sam's heart pounded with a swirl of fear and determination. This was the moment he had waited for, a chance to avoid further bloodshed. If he could secure an agreement that recognized the Reach's autonomy and reduced the oppressive demands, then perhaps they could avert a full-scale war. If the crown insisted on unconditional surrender, Sam would have no choice but to stand firm. And so Sam set out once again, accompanied by a small retinue, this time as a lord, a rebel leader, carrying Heartsbane at his side. The crown of responsibility weighed more heavily on him than any steel helm could. He could not know what awaited him in King's Landing: intrigue, betrayal, or perhaps a genuine peace. But one thing was certain. Samwell Tarley, once the craven boy who cowered at his father's feet, now stood at the forefront of a rebellion that spanned the entire Reach. He had raised Heartsbane not merely as a sword, but as a symbol of defiance and a hope for a better future, however precarious that hope might be. He left Horn Hill in the hands of trusted allies, reflecting on how far he had come. The men cheered him as he departed through the gates, some calling him Lord Sam the Brave, a moniker that made him blush and wonder if he deserved it. Every step of his journey thus far had been fraught with fear, uncertainty, and painful choices. But there was no turning back. Randall Tarley's legacy had loomed over him for years, but Sam was forging his own path, rallying rebels against a crown he deemed unworthy to rule without conscience. The future of the Reach and perhaps all Westeros hung in the balance. Yet Samwell Tarley held his head high, Heartsbane gleaming at his hip, resolute in his new purpose. He would not be the man his father tried to shape. He would be more than that, and he would see this through to whatever end fate had in store.